David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There is some super interesting geopolitics that have developed around the recent G7 meetings. There's going to be a lot of G7 talk today. And the obvious stuff remains obvious, right? I mean, Trump is incompetent. He's undiplomatic. He's ignorant. He is effectively a petulant child on the world stage. But you've got to sort of hand it to the guy. He's creating some pretty damn interesting scenarios. Now, as you know, Donald Trump abandoned the Iran nuclear deal. This was an Obama-era deal. Iran abided by its rules. Trump never liked the deal. Trump has been wanting to abandon anything that has Barack Obama's name or signature on it. So Donald Trump bailed on that deal. And as expected, Iran immediately said, well, if you're out, we'll start doing nuclear research again. Why wouldn't we if we did nothing wrong and yet you are such an unreliable partner in treaties, the U.S. under Donald Trump, that you bail, we'll just go back to doing what's in our best interest. And Donald Trump said, well, hold on a second. We bailed on the deal, but you still have to abide by it because there are other European countries that are still in it. A very strange geopolitical attempt to sort of have your cake and eat it too. And I told you from day one, this is a disaster and it's completely short-sighted, very much like Donald Trump's China tariffs, as we're now seeing. But there's now something very interesting happening with Iran. Iran's foreign minister flew to Biarritz this weekend for the G7 sideline meetings, the meetings happening on the sidelines of the official G7. Iran's not part of the G7, but their foreign minister was there. And we've now learned that Iran's foreign minister met with his French counterpart, and French President Macron has now drawn a line in the sand saying, hold on a second. France, Britain, Germany, and Japan, we want to do diplomacy. We want to figure this thing out. The U.S. has bailed. Trump has completely abandoned a deal that Iran followed the rules of. But now France and the other three countries remaining are going to try to do diplomacy. They're going to try to convince Iran not to start violating the deal. And meanwhile, Emmanuel Macron and friends are going to push Donald Trump not to sanction Iran more and more and to put a de facto blockade on petroleum sales. This is France jumping in and effectively upstaging Donald Trump. What Macron is trying to do is fascinating because of the middleman position that he's created for himself and for France. On the one hand, he's looking to get Iran to do what it was that the deal successfully put in place anyway, and Iran stuck to for the duration that Donald Trump was in the deal, that the U.S. was in the deal, which is don't do nuclear development. On the other hand, Emmanuel Macron is saying, we'll be on your side, Iran. We as the adults left in the deal, France, Germany, Britain, Japan, we will try to convince that petulant child, Donald Trump, to stop the sanctions and to stop the escalation against you. And I told you that this was happening with global climate change discussions, and it is, and I'll have a story about that for you on today's show. But the world is increasingly going around Trump, not just on climate change. They are seeing him as the petulant obstacle that you have to get around rather than work with. And it's not just with climate change. Here it's happening with foreign policy and geopolitics and nuclear proliferation, or trying to prevent the nuclear proliferation. Other people have figured it out. They don't actually need Trump to make things happen beyond just needing to placate Trump and get him out of the way, just enough to get Donald Trump out of the way. How out of place must Trump feel at these G7 things? Everybody else is educated and worldly and diplomatic. They listen to advisors. They listen to their intelligence experts. They understand geopolitics. And in comes Donald Trump, who cheats at golf and sexually harasses dozens of women. Trump maybe doesn't even realize how out of place he actually is. And good for Macron. He's doing the right thing here. He's doing what's in the best interests more broadly of not only the participants in the Iran nuclear deal, but quite frankly, of the world. Iran was abiding by the deal. You can have a broader conversation about if the U.S. gets to have nukes, why doesn't Iran get to have them? That's a conversation some in my audience want to have. And that's a perfectly reasonable conversation to have. To the extent that we had this deal, and to the extent that we don't want Iran to obtain nuclear weapons, which I don't, and I'm glad to talk about that further if the reasons why aren't obvious. But they were abiding by the deal. They were doing their part, and Donald Trump willy-nilly said, we're out. Good for Macron. Let's now talk about the fiasco that was Trump at the G7 related to climate change, completely predictably. So one of the biggest issues of our time is one of the issues where the United States internationally is no longer really a participant in the discussion. They're no longer really at the table thanks to Donald Trump. And that topic is climate change. The climate crisis is now. It's not some vague thing in the future. People are dying from climate change and pollution-related issues right now. Now is when we are either going to figure it out or not figure it out and continue to fall further and further behind, more and more urgently behind in figuring this out. It's a national security issue. It's a moral issue. It's a physical issue with regard to the physical health impact that climate change has on humans and animals on this planet and biodiversity of the non-animal kind as well. And Donald Trump has been clear. Climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese. It's not a problem. The U.S. is out of the Paris Climate Accords. So other countries have to take the lead. It's not the U.S. who's going to do it. And so now, if you want to be at the forefront of fighting climate change, you don't go to the U.S., you go to China, you go to India, and you go to other countries. And this is becoming a vicious circle, a sort of self-fulfilling or self-perpetuating prophecy. Trump simply didn't go to yesterday's G7 meeting about the climate. This was the place to talk about the Amazon rainforest fires, which, by the way, the G7 said we're going to throw 20 million at it. There are movies, as has been pointed out on Twitter, that have budgets that are more than 5 times the amount of money that these 7 countries are saying we will devote to the Amazon fire issue. This was the meeting about cutting carbon emissions, about dealing with the crisis that is now, which is climate change. Trump just wasn't there. Trump was later asked, why weren't you at the climate session? He said, oh, we're having it in a little while. A reporter tried to explain to him that it's in the past. It already happened. Time moves forward. And Trump didn't seem to hear him, but he says we have the cleanest air and the cleanest water on the planet, which is, of course, both ridiculous and untrue.
And the climate session? Say it. Did you make it to the climate session? Were there any conclusions that you took?
I'm going to. In fact, it's going to be our next session. So we haven't had it yet.
Do you have a message that you'd like to deliver to?
No, I want clean air and clean water. And we're right now having the cleanest air and cleanest water on the planet. But that's what I want. I want absolutely clean air and clean water.
Living in a complete fantasy world, as usual. And it was later reported that Trump wasn't there, but someone from his team was. French President Macron also said, oh, I did broach the topic of the fires with Trump, and Trump wants the fires put out. So, okay, there's that. Now, I hate to admit this, because I want the United States to be part of the climate change discussion. We're one of the biggest users of fossil fuels. We have to be part of the solution, but there's probably way more progress to be made when Donald Trump is not participating. The guy suggested bombing hurricanes to stop them. The guy thinks climate change is a hoax created by China. What can he really add to a discussion about climate change? And unfortunately, the reality is that Donald Trump's constituents only make this more feasible. You've got the people who just don't understand climate change, so they don't believe in it. You've got the partisan hacks who just think it's a matter of opinion and liberals are wrong because they want to be on the other opposite side of liberals. You've got the religious nuts who believe God would never make it possible for humans to hurt the planet. And then you've got like the business and industry people who probably believe climate change and accept the science, but they recognize that their businesses potentially become less profitable if we take climate change seriously. And so you have this perfect constituency to do nothing about climate change and to feel good and justified about doing nothing, either because they're owning the libs or because of God or because of whatever else. Now, I understand why Trump didn't go to the meeting. I'm more left wondering why Trump even went to the G7. His big contribution was bringing Melania, who got media attention for kissing Emmanuel Macron, for suggesting Russia be allowed back into the G7, which we'll talk about a little bit later, Trump did nothing else notable in the positive sense, right? Why do these sissy Europeans keep talking about things like climate and nuclear weapons and the environment and trade? What about golf scores and Mar-a-Lago? Trump should really just stop going. And I hate to say it because the U.S. not being a participant short term is a very, very bad thing. But my thought is this guy is adding nothing and he's just embarrassing us. Maybe the next president can start showing up and actually participating in more of a productive and respectable way. I believe that we are actually at that point where Trump just shouldn't even go to this stuff. Let me know if you agree, disagree with me. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And of course, we are now on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. Make sure you follow us there and subscribe free with Twitch Prime if you've got an Amazon Prime account.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day, Jamie Berland and Michael Bartley. Thanks to both of you. Really appreciate every single member who has signed up. Also want to say thanks to David Rosenberg, who's been a member for almost 5 years now. Today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Join these great people at www.joinpakman.com. Takes under a minute to sign up. You can save 40% if you please with the coupon code THISIS2020. I have some really strange video for you today. It has been just embarrassing anecdote after embarrassing anecdote from the G7 in France for Donald Trump over the last few days. And I really want to do this thoroughly, and that's why the entire show so far has been G7 related stuff. Donald Trump's only notable contribution to the G7, as I mentioned before, has been ruining a dinner with world leaders by insisting that Russia be added back into the G7 to once again make it the G8, which it used to be until 2014. He's contributed no ideas to better the planet. He skipped the climate change meeting. He's made no sense in almost everything he said. But the sort of height or the bottom of this embarrassing fiasco was Donald Trump's explanation of why he wants to add Russia to the G7. Now, I'm going to play the clip for you. It's under 90 seconds in duration. But in the clip, Trump attacks Obama on foreign soil, a bad look for presidents, says things that are just straight up wrong, which is not probably a shock to you, and seems to suggest that Russia should be back in the G7 because Putin took Crimea from Ukraine while Obama was president. I know that that doesn't seem to make any logical sense because it doesn't make any logical sense, but it seems to be what Donald Trump is saying. Let's take a look.
It was a President Obama. I'm not blaming him, but a lot of bad things happened with President Putin and President Obama. One of the things that happened was, as you know, what happened with a very big area, a very, very big and important area in the Middle East where the red line was drawn, and then President Obama decided that he was not going to do anything about it. You can't draw red lines in the sand. You just can't do it. And the other was in Ukraine, having to do with a certain section of Ukraine that you know very well, where it was sort of taken away from President Obama. Not taken away from President Trump, taken away from President Obama. President Obama was not happy that this happened because it was embarrassing to him, right? It was very embarrassing to him. And he wanted Russia to be out of what was called the G8. And that was his determination. He was outsmarted by Putin. He was outsmarted. President Putin outsmarted President Obama. Wait a minute. And I can understand how President Obama would feel. He wasn't happy, and they're not in for that reason. Now, I'm only thinking about the world, and I'm thinking about this country in terms of the G7, whether it's G7, G8. I think it would be better to have Russia inside the tent than outside the tent.
Why doesn't Trump name anything? An important area with a red line, Syria, a certain section of Ukraine that you know well, Crimea. Putin took Crimea, not from Trump, but from Obama. Therefore, Trump wants Putin back in the G7. So I'm trying to read between the lines here. I think maybe what Donald Trump is saying is that Obama screwed up with Russia. Russia took Crimea from Ukraine under Obama's watch. This embarrassed Obama, or it angered Obama, so Obama retaliated by unfairly kicking Russia out of the then G8. And that's a silly reason to have Russia out, so Trump wants them back in. Basically, what Trump seems to be trying to articulate in a completely failing way is Obama wanted Russia out, and I do the opposite of Obama, so bring Russia back in. Now, there are so many logical contortions or pretzels here. One is not everything that happens while someone is president is their fault. Like, is it Donald Trump's fault or responsibility that Argentina's economy is crashing even more right now? It's not. It's happening while Trump is president, but not because Donald Trump is president. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that Trump sort of seems to be saying, since Putin outsmarted Obama and took Crimea from Ukraine under Obama's watch, he doesn't deserve any punishment for it. And getting kicked out of the G8 was Obama's way of punishing him for it, or something like that, which is bizarre. And then also remember that Russia was suspended from the G8 after annexing Crimea on the vote of all of the other G8 members, period. There are many criticisms that we can make of the G8 or the G7, which are valid. Number one, they're not doing nearly enough to fight climate change. That's a very significant and prescient criticism of the G7. They are perpetuating the status quo of damaging neoliberal globalization rather than limiting it. That is a fair and accurate critique of the G7. They are lacking buy-in from some major industrialized countries, more like what you see in the G20. But this is not only childish nonsense that Donald Trump is adding I'm calling it a critique, although to call it that stretches credulity significantly. It also is not even really adding to the serious critiques that there are of the G7 and of the ways in which these seven or the broader G20 nations control so many aspects of the everyday lives of so many people on this planet. And it's just, it's a waste of time. It's a diplomatic embarrassment. And it's a geopolitical embarrassment, quite frankly, for Americans who have to, if they understand what's going on. I know the Trumpists defend everything that the guy does, but if you understand what's going on, you see the U.S. embarrassed day after day, press conference after press conference by Donald Trump. And the sort of height of this is what I want to talk about next, which is that Donald Trump wants the next G7 at one of his golf clubs. If you want to hear a story about the height of kleptocracy, or maybe better said, the depths of cronyism currently in charge of our country, this is the story for you. Donald Trump has confirmed that he wants to host next year's G7 summit at his own Doral golf club in Miami, Florida. This would be completely unconstitutional, and this is not my opinion, it's the opinion of legal and political experts, because there's this thing called the Emoluments clause. Asked why he wants to do this, this is hilarious, Donald Trump said, well, it's convenient because it's close to Miami Airport. Check out a visibly sweaty, sniffing, and confused Trump making the case for this after arguing with a reporter about what counts as a question, and then making himself a martyr for willing to be president of the United States. Take a look.
Here we go.
I actually have a question for you on next year's G7 summit, but can I just clarify something you said? You mentioned earlier today.
One question. Go ahead.
Let me do the clarification and then I'll get to the question.
No.
You talked about
One
calls
question.
with China and a breaking news alert. I'm trying to understand what specifically you heard from China. And on next year's G7, you alluded today, dropped several hints about Miami, about Doral, and hosting next year's G7 at your property. What reassurances, if any, can you give the American people that you are not looking to profit off the presidency?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've spent, and I think I will, in a combination of loss and opportunity. Probably it'll cost me anywhere from $3 to $5 billion to be president. And the only thing I care about is this country. Couldn't care less, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. People have asked me, what do you think it costs? And between opportunity, not doing things, I used to get a lot of money to make speeches. Now I give speeches all the time. You know what I get? Zippo, and that's good. And I did a lot of great jobs and great deals that I don't do anymore, and I don't want to do them because the deals I'm making are great deals for the country, and that's to me much more important. Doral happens to be within Miami. It's a city. It's a wonderful place. It's a very, very successful area of Florida. It's very importantly only 5 minutes from the airport. The airport's right next door. It's a big international airport, one of the biggest in the world. Everybody that's coming, all of these people with all of their big entourages come. It's set up so, and by the way, my people looked at 12 sites, all good, but some were 2 hours from an airport, some were 4 hours from, I mean, they were so far away. Some didn't allow this or they didn't allow that. With Doral, we have a series of magnificent buildings. We call them bungalows. They each hold from 50 to 70 very luxurious rooms.
Trump also very interested in racking up minibar revenue during the G7. That's why he wants Russia back in. Putin's entourage will show up to Doral in the new G8, and they will just owe Trump tons of money because of all the vodka consumption. I mean, this is just so stupid and so illegal, completely unconstitutional. This would violate the Emoluments Clause against a government official self-enriching by virtue of being in office. If Donald Trump was not president, there would be no discussion of holding a G7 at a Trump golf club. This is a way in which Donald Trump is self-enriching by virtue of being president of the United States, or potentially self-enriching. Trump constantly sends signals to foreign officials about where should they spend their money. Trump has already racked up endless violations of the Emoluments Clause, and this would be another one. And the thing with Trump is, maybe it's a good thing compared to corruption behind closed doors, although there's plenty of that with Trump. With Trump, a lot of the corruption is out in the open. I'm wondering, is it possible that doing the corruption and the cronyism out in the open helps Trump get away with it in some way? If the G7 was at some secret location and later it turned out that it was Doral or Mar-a-Lago, maybe that leads to more outrage and consequences than Donald Trump just saying straight up at my golf club. For all of the kowtowing to and praying to the altar of the Constitution, though, I would love to just hear Republicans say, this can't happen. This can't happen. But even though they fetishize the Constitution, it's actually a lot like the Bible for them. We've talked about how a lot of Republicans are all about the Bible, but not really. They're all about the parts that are convenient for them. Something about abortion, something about gay marriage because man lying with another man or whatever. Otherwise, who cares when the Bible is not convenient for you? They similarly claim to be all about the Constitution, but it's only certain parts, right? The Second Amendment and their complete misinterpretation of it, that they are definitely in favor of for sure. The First Amendment, for people they agree with, absolutely. The Emoluments Clause, that sounds like something that should only apply to Democratic presidents. And I'll tell you this, if Trump wants to do the G7 next year at Doral or Mar-a-Lago or whatever, he will probably get away with it. The way it will go down is we'll hear it's about to happen for month after month after month. Outrage, panels, debates. Then it will happen, even though legal experts say, oh yeah, this is clearly illegal. It'll be a week of corporate media panels about, is this impeachable? Is it not impeachable? Blah, blah, blah. Legal experts, again, will continue to be united and say, yeah, this is illegal. Then Trump will threaten to nuke a tropical storm or something, and everybody will move on and forget about it, and he'll get away with it like he's gotten away with everything else. Fiasco after fiasco. Cronyism, swamp filling, worldwide embarrassments. The media outrage cycle chases it for their own benefit. And then we move on to something else when Trump says, let's bomb a hurricane or send people back to S-hole countries or whatever. And there's a very good chance, I hate to tell you this, there's a good chance this is not going to end in January of 2021 with the inauguration of a Democratic president. There is a good chance, and we need to recognize it, and we need to prepare mentally for it, because I don't want to see the crying on November whatever 2020, if and when this happens. There's a good chance this is going to go on until January of 2025, when Donald Trump will be 78 years old and will be completing 8 years as president of the United States. Be prepared, buckle up because it may well be happening. That is sort of the bulk wrapping up our G7 coverage yesterday and today. It has been an extraordinary embarrassment. Half the country thinks that it was some major alpha male victory of some kind for Donald Trump. But anybody who understands sort of how the world works and basic geopolitics and diplomacy understands that this was truly the height of embarrassment for our country. Make sure you follow the David Pakman Show on Instagram, at David Pakman Show. We will have a poll and other content related to the G7. And while you're there, follow me at david.pakman. I have posted a video to my Instagram of a Portuguese dog. Now, I don't mean a Portuguese water dog. I'm not talking about the breed. I'm talking about a dog from Portugal named Pulga, which means flea in Spanish, or presumably in Portuguese as well, I'm guessing, who watches the David Pakman Show. Okay, there is a Portuguese dog that watches the David Pakman Show daily, and I have a video of that dog on my Instagram at david.pakman. Follow me there. We'll take a quick break. Much, much more after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Adam Frank, who's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, also author of the book Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. Adam, so great to have you on today.
Real pleasure.
So just to begin with, if we want to broadly start thinking about the idea of life in the universe outside of Earth, there are those who make sort of mathematical, probabilistic arguments. If you consider the size of the universe, it's mathematically likely that there is life elsewhere. There are others who make arguments sort of along different lines. What is the best filter or frame through which you think is most useful to think about that question of life elsewhere in the universe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the probabilistic arguments still are the best, especially given the what I like to call the exoplanet revolution of the last 20 years or so. So, when people started thinking about this via the Drake equation, that's really where the probabilistic arguments came from. In 1960, we really didn't know much about what was out there in terms of just the baseline for where life could form. And now we know that every star in the sky pretty much has planets. So we did a paper a few years ago that used the empirical data to set kind of a baseline on how, this one way of framing it is, how unlikely would it have to be for us to be the only civilization in the universe? And it turns out to be 1 in 10 billion trillion. Like the odds per habitable planet would have to be less than 1 in 10 billion trillion in order for us to be the only time it's happened. That number is so low that you're really beginning to stretch the bounds of credibility. So, we know now that there's so many planets, so many places for life to form, that I think that way of understanding it is the right way of sort of getting a handle on at least whether or not civilizations have happened before. It doesn't mean there's anybody around now, but whether or not, we're a one-off.
So how different are the questions of, is there life elsewhere in the universe versus is there currently what we would call intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? Because those might sound like similar questions, but mathematically they might be drastically different.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, they could be enormously different. If you look at the history of the Earth, for example, microbial life seems to have appeared very rapidly after the Earth formed, 4 billion years ago or so. And it took intelligence. Intelligence, literally only happened yesterday. So if you just look at that, it seems like you can use that argument to say, look, microbial life, basic life is going to be very easy to form, but getting intelligence may require a lot more accidents, so to speak, to happen. You got to pile them on, So I think it's reasonable to separate those out. But when it comes to finding life, it may be that it may be easier to find signatures of technological civilizations than it is finding evidence on distant planets of just microbial life.
When we think about the idea of intelligent life now versus at some point in the past, which you alluded to, let's dig into that a little bit. There's this concept of some kind of possible filter, which
Right.
might explain why we have not heard from other intelligent forms of life. And that may be that once life gets to a certain level of intelligence, something happens that destroys it. It could be self-destruction. It could be something else. Can you talk a little bit about that concept and how it should sort of inform our analysis of this?
Sure. That's what's called the great filter. But if you don't mind, if we just step back a little bit,
Yep.
because there is this question people have like, oh, we've been looking for so long and we haven't seen anything. That is sometimes called the great silence. And it turns out that's not true. I mean, what people have to understand about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is that really NASA or anybody else has never funded a very detailed search. So recently, there was a paper that was done where basically a couple of astronomers looked at how much of the sky we've looked at. And so if the sky was like the ocean, we have only searched right now through a hot tub. So, if you looked at a hot tub and didn't find any dolphins, you wouldn't say, oh, the ocean doesn't have any dolphins in it. So that's something that's very important to know, is that we haven't looked very hard. So we don't know. But the great filter argument is the possibility that, or posits that, yeah, there's something that either keeps intelligent civilizations from forming or they don't last long, right? Because if every civilizations could be popping up all the time, but if they all last 200 years, which may be how long we last, then, there's not going to be many out there to talk to. So the great filter could be in our past. It could be that it's very hard to form intelligence, for example, and somehow we got through, hooray. Or the great filter could be climate change. It could be that everybody triggers climate change and very few civilizations are smart enough to get through it. So most of them end with their climate change period. So the great filter could be hiding like a snake in our future, or it's in the past and we got lucky.
That's interesting. So let's talk about climate change a little bit. The idea would be that dealing with climate change, that intelligent life inevitably starts to modify their environment in such a way that it will ultimately, potentially at least, cause the self-destruction of that environment, of that civilization. This is merely speculative at this point, or how much has that concept caught on in the context of great filter discussions?
Well, it's, this is the work that I and my colleagues have been doing. And, we've been arguing that it's really hard not to trigger climate change. What is a civilization? What do we mean from a scientific point about what a civilization is? It's basically a species that has become very successful at harvesting energy from their planet. Now, we now know enough about planets from studying Earth's history, from Mars, Venus, the moon Titan around Saturn, that we understand climate really well. And if you're going to harvest a huge amount of energy to do work, which is what civilization is, you're going to have a feedback on your planet. It's going to be hard not to have a feedback on a planet. So, first of all, this totally changes how we look at climate change, right? The question now is no longer, did we change the climate? Instead, it's like, duh, what did you expect to happen? You built a giant civilization. So then the next question is, does this always happen? And I think the argument, we've been running models. We've been, starting off with simplified models of planets and civilizations, very generic. And what we find is that you always trigger climate change. It's hard not to feedback on your planet. And then the question is, who gets through, right? What does it take to get you through this period and come to a new equilibrium with your planet? And that's very much an open question. We did find, luckily, that some of the models led to a new steady state, change climate, but the whole, your civilization doesn't die off. But also many of the models showed collapse as well. So, there's a lot more work to be done on this. But I think the answer is that pretty much every technological civilization triggers climate change, and some will get through and many won't.
So there's the movement that is the search for extraterrestrial life and or intelligence. There's a movement that is a sort of space exploration movement for the preservation of Homo sapiens. The idea that eventually it could be because of climate change in 50 years. It could be because the sun expands and engulfs the earth in much longer than that. But eventually there will need to be some other place for Homo sapiens if the species is to persist. There is the idea of exploring space for the benefit of technological development to be used here on Earth. There's all these different areas.
Right.
Question one, do these interact with each other in substantively meaningful ways, or are they relatively siloed endeavors and priorities? And number two, what's your more general sense of what the relationship should be of humans to space exploration right now and sort of over the next 10 to 20 years?
Those are great questions. Well, for your first one about the siloing, they were siloed, but what's remarkable is that with climate change, they can't be siloed anymore, right? Climate change, we think of climate change in terms of this, we're running around like a chicken with our heads cut off. Half the country doesn't even think it's happening. The other half is terrified. And I think what we have to understand is that climate change is actually a profound transformation. It's a moment. It's like adolescence, right? When you become an adolescent, you've now gained enough power over yourself that you can have the keys to a car. We now have the keys to a planet. We never would have learned about this unless we were doing space exploration, right? We only really figured out climate change because we were looking at the Earth from orbit, or we were looking at other planets. Understanding Mars and Venus were instrumental to our understanding climate change. So, space exploration, are becoming a spacefaring race, are becoming triggering climate change, and are recognizing climate change all fit together. And I think that's going to be true of any civilization. So we now have to recognize that all of these things are happening at the same time because they're supposed to happen at the same time. You trigger climate change, when you become a spacefaring race, because that's when you have the industrial capability, and you don't get to know that you triggered climate change unless you're a spacefaring race. And then hopefully you learn what to do with it. So one thing also I want to point out, though, there is no planet B. Like, there's no way that we're going to get to Mars. We're going to be able to offload to Mars to deal with climate change. We have to deal with climate change here on Earth. But here's it for your second question. I think that what is important is that we are just about to become truly a spacefaring race. Like the last 50 years, we've taken our first tentative steps. And now with the new space movement, as you're pointing out, with Elon Musk and the commercial utilization of space, we are poised to begin settling the solar system. And I'm a big fan of this for many reasons, but mainly it's because, in some sense, the next 1,000 years or so of human history, if we make it through climate change, is going to be the settlement of the solar system, because the stars are too far away. Barring a technological miracle, the solar system is really where the next 1,000 years of our history gets played out. So if we can get through climate change and we can, manage to understand how to have a thriving ecosystem on Earth, we're going to learn enough to start building artificial ecosystems, large artificial ecosystems elsewhere in the solar system. So it's all very tightly coupled together for me.
When we think about policy between countries, between nation states with regard to space, it's sort of a Wild West right now. I mean, you've got I believe it's the Moon Treaty from the 70s, and there's one piece of legislation that I think is more recent. But how soon do you think that the lack of legal infrastructure in space will become relevant based on what it is that's planned over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, we're already in trouble.
Okay.
We're already at the end of those treaties. Very quickly, we're going to need to start rethinking this. Because, if you want to have a thriving space economy, I am all for the, economic using space, not just exploration, but beginning to start thinking about it in terms of commercial activity, because nobody's going there unless there's money to be made, right? And that's how you'll start building thriving, new, interesting communities, people trying all different kinds of experiments in democracy and other good things, in these settlements. So you have to be able to ensure both the commercial viability. People have to be able to invest and have a return on their investment. But also, at the same time, you've also got to make sure that all of space is open for everybody. You don't want to have like two corporations battling it out for the ownership of space. So there's a lot of very tricky legal precedents that we're going to have to establish over the next few years. And right now, as you said, it's a Wild West. So people need to really understand that space is not just for, heroic astronauts anymore. Very soon it's going to be for working people and investors and explorers. So, yeah, we're right on the lip of that.
I don't doubt that. At the same time, what scares me is I have this idea, and maybe it's an incredibly naive and idealistic thing, that progress in space would be an extremely sort of uniting process for humans on Earth, that the imaginary borders between countries would become far less relevant as we start to become a spacefaring race. And I mean, imagine for a second if we were to encounter intelligent life elsewhere. Where I get scared is I feel as though it being hyper commercialized from the beginning will basically just transfer all the same problems we're already dealing with here to space, and it will sort of counteract that possible uniting force. Is that a concern that you share, or am I maybe missing something?
No, I think that's a good concern. That's why these treaties have to balance. We have to learn from our mistakes in our various periods of colonization over the last 10,000 years. We have to learn from our mistakes in the past about how to explore, because that's what we do. Human beings are always going over the next hill looking for a better deal. So how to both have that need to expand, but also do it sensibly and do it with some kind of compassion, both for the environments that we're touching, even if they're not living, as well as ourselves. So, my hope is that, that is going to be possible. So, but that's going to be very tricky. But again, that's why this is so tied to climate change. Like, in many ways, we're going to have to reorganize ourselves on a pretty deep level in order to get through climate change as well. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And all of it poses the possibility, either you can go down the same road, and make the same mistakes, or you have these possibilities of really reconfiguring the way you do civilization in ways that will be more free, more compassionate, and allow life of all kinds to thrive.
Make sure you check out the book Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. We've been speaking, of course, with the book's author, Adam Frank, who's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester. Adam, really a pleasure having you today.
It was really fun talking. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, let's get into the polling news. A lot of people asking me to talk about this, and there is a lot of interesting stuff happening, but also a lot of misreporting about some of what's going on. So there is big news out of the 2020 Democratic primary, which is that there are now two polls which show the Democratic primary to be a statistical three-way tie between the presumed frontrunner, former VP Joe Biden, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, the headlines are going crazy with all sorts of claims that are not backed by the data, and they're ignoring that there have actually been three recent polls, one of which paints a very different picture, which we shouldn't ignore either. So let's look at what we have here, starting with a new Monmouth poll. In the Monmouth poll, you will see that over the last 2 months, Bernie Sanders has jumped from 14 to 20%. Elizabeth Warren has jumped from 15 to 20%. And Joe Biden has dropped bigly from 32 to 19%. This is Biden down 13 points, Bernie and Warren gaining. And when you consider the margin of error, this is statistically, at least possibly, a three-way tie in the 2020 Democratic primary. Everything else, every other candidate, basically identical to 2 months ago. So this is just one poll, and it's a statistical tie. This is not the only poll, however, that says that we now have a statistical tie. There is a new Economist YouGov poll, which has Biden at 22, Sanders at 19, and Warren at 17. When you account for the margin of error, plus or minus a little more than 2.5 percentage points, you have also potentially a statistical tie. And then, and this is what a lot of people aren't talking about, the newest poll of all is a Politico poll, which says actually Biden's still very solidly in the lead. The new Politico poll, which is not being talked about very much, says Biden 33, Sanders 20, Warren 15, suggesting that everything is basically the way it's been for a month or a little bit longer. So, generally speaking, is the race swinging more and more away from Joe Biden? Yes, it is. Is it believable that Joe Biden lost 13 points over the last 2 months, as one poll says? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. It seems like a lot. It seems that there's definitely been a shift away from Biden. And as a progressive, I want a progressive to win the Democratic nomination. So I'm not saying I'm not glad about it, but I'm skeptical that Biden really lost 13 points over the last 2 months. There are still plenty of polls that have Joe Biden ahead. But the big story here, there's no doubt, there is a big story here in terms of the trend line. Trend number one, it's not going well for Joe Biden. He was polling more than 40% when he announced several months ago. Trend number two, Joe Biden's losses are mostly helping Bernie and Warren, not more establishment candidates like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, at some point, this is going to become a real issue. Are Bernie and Warren splitting the progressive vote? I was asked this in an audience question a month ago, or maybe it was more like 6 weeks ago. People have been asking me, shouldn't Bernie or Warren get out in order to let the other progressive consolidate the progressive vote? Because clearly, if Bernie drops, Warren gets all of his support. And if Warren drops, Bernie gets all of her support. I am not so sure about those numbers. I was looking yesterday. Yes, if Elizabeth Warren drops out, some of her support goes to Bernie. If Bernie drops out, some of his support goes to Warren. But there are a number of polls which suggest that the numbers here are a little bit different. One survey has Sanders supporters saying their top second choice is Biden, and Warren supporters saying their top second choice is Harris. And what this suggests to me is that this is much more delineated among demographic lines than ideological. So I don't think we should be too quick to assume that if Bernie drops, his 19% goes to Warren, or if Warren drops, her 17% or whatever goes to Bernie, because the polls right now are not suggesting that that's the case. But at a certain point, there is going to be a question of, will this all work itself out? It's a good thing to see that the progressive movement has 35 to 40% support right now, just among Bernie and Warren. But could it at some point prevent a more progressive candidate from defeating Joe Biden? That is a question we're going to be looking at more this week and into next week. Lastly, there are now 10 people qualified for the third debate in a couple of weeks. It's Biden, Buttigieg, Harris, Sanders, Warren, Booker, O'Rourke, Klobuchar, Castro, and Yang. They've qualified on donor criteria and polling criteria. We have Tom Steyer, Tulsi Gabbard, and Marianne Williamson qualified on number of donors, but not qualified on polling. They may or may not be in the next debate. Everybody else will be out. So the number is starting to diminish. And I think that that is actually a good thing. I have a clip for you today of right-wing pundit Ben Shapiro, which may be his dumbest ever. And I know that that is saying a lot. Shapiro is known for employing a technique of speaking quickly and confidently, which to some people gives the idea that he knows what he's talking about, but he often says really silly things. Quick reminder, here he is talking with me about gun control when I interviewed him a few years ago, and it didn't really take that much to get him visibly confused.
It's a very simple argument from my point of view, and that is that people, if they have the right to bear arms in order to prevent tyranny, then that goes for arms to prevent, that goes to the ultimate limit of that is the arms necessary to prevent, basically you can own any arm that is necessary, not to prevent tyranny.
Anyway, make sure you check out that entire interview. But let's talk about Ben's latest comment. The latest comment is, America has already apologized for slavery. The Civil War was a national apology for slavery.
1619, as folks are calling it, is a massive retelling of the American story with African Americans appropriately at its center. It is the kind of retelling that continues putting the calls for reparations in their proper context and makes the absence of a national apology all the more galling. So, in other words, it backs Jonathan Capehart's agenda. There was a national apology for slavery. It was called the Civil War, where 700,000 Americans died. So that seems to have been kind of important in American history.
This may be the dumbest thing he's said. There is no interpretation in which this makes sense. There was a national apology for slavery called the Civil War, where 700,000 Americans died. The Civil War was not an apology for slavery. The Civil War was only necessary because half the country was willing to die to keep slavery. Who apologized? Someone who does the fighting to keep slavery is not apologizing for slavery. Someone who dies fighting for the Union, trying to abolish slavery, is not apologizing for slavery. They're not even defending it. How could they possibly be apologizing for it? This makes no sense under any circumstances. And I'm having trouble understanding whether Ben Shapiro doesn't understand history or doesn't understand slavery or doesn't understand the definition of apology, or maybe some combination of the three. If the South was apologizing for slavery, why did they put up endless monuments to Civil War generals who were fighting for slavery? That's not usually how apologies work. And so what you have to understand is that Ben Shapiro serves a role in right-wing media, and he plays a character in right-wing media. The character he plays is the facts and logic guy, but really it's just his delivery that may give people that impression, not the content of what he says. The role he plays is the intellectual right-winger who provides rock-solid arguments for right-wingers to feel good about their incorrect and immoral positions. And that's how you end up believing that single payer is some form of slavery against doctors, and yet actual slavery is bad, but the U.S. has already apologized for it by having a civil war. Now, there is maybe a silver lining here. Some of you probably are anticipating this. He seems to be admitting that the Civil War was about slavery. That's sort of an accomplishment, because very often right-wingers love to say, Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. States' rights, of course, to own slaves. But he's actually saying that it seems to have been about slavery. And I think that that is actually an accomplishment in some way, shape, or form, maybe some kind of progress. I do get scared when people call into this show and they say, David, I'm on the left and I love what you do, but I like to hear strong, reasoned arguments from the right. So I listen to Ben Shapiro. That's scary stuff, and we should all be very scared when we hear people say that. We have a voicemail number. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a question about the 2020 Democratic primary.
Yeah, hey, David. I want to get your take on a Sanders-Warren ticket for 2020. Maybe it's too early to say anything like that, but I think they have a good chance of taking down Trump, if they join forces and we kind of hit them with everything we got. I just want to get your take on that, David, and enjoy your show. Cheers.
So listen, I do think it's a little early to talk about that. I would love to, in November of 2020, go and vote for Warren Sanders or Sanders Warren. Personally, I think that would be great. I am sort of skeptical of this idea that Democrats always employ, where they pick a vice presidential running mate on the basis of, we want someone from the South or the Midwest to appeal to evangelicals or whatever. I think that strategy is out, and I think we just need the best people on progressive policy. So I don't know the answer. We've talked before about when is the right time to start having that conversation. I don't know that it's now, but I do think it's pretty soon. And the idea being, we need to start thinking more in total about what this ticket is going to look like and how it's going to be able to fight and run against Trump-Pence. But on a personal level, I would love to vote for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on a ticket, no matter who is at the top of that ticket. Make sure you are a member or patron so that you can get access to the daily bonus show. Sign up at joinpacman.com or patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I'll see you then. Otherwise, see you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.